everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Retention and Privacy Management, Automated Together. I'm Teresa Resick, Vice President of Market Intelligence here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And Iron Mountain is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them very much for their support, and certainly thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. And as we get started, just want to offer a few tips to help you participate in our webinar. Just look to the chat feature, and in here, we're going to be sharing a link for you to download some resources. And also feel free to go into the chat right now, say hello, and let us know where you're listening from. Ask questions of the speakers by using the chat feature. You can also use Q&A. We do have that open, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can later in our webcast. Would also appreciate it if at the end of our event, if you would take our feedback survey. I truly value everything you do have to say, and let us know how we did today. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Learning Center page in just a few days. So now to introduce the lineup of folks that we have with us today. And with us from AIIM, we have Peggy Winton, and with over 30 years of organizational and business development experience, Peggy is responsible for the strategic, technical, and customer growth direction of AIIM. As Chief Executive Officer, she leads a team focused on helping organizations meet their digital transformation objectives with understanding, anticipating, and redefining internal and external customer experiences. And also joining us from Iron Mountain, we have Greg Muir, who's the Senior Product Manager there. And in that role, Greg is focused on enabling cutting-edge AI and machine learning technologies to unlock powerful information contained within unstructured content. In his 25 years of market experience, Greg has been influential in driving data and analytical strategies to provide actionable results, specifically around customer loyalty, next best action, card utilization, account design, and customer onboarding. Additionally, Greg has helped companies ensure that these efforts are compliant with the recent changes in data protection regulations, such as GDPR and CCPA. And he does that through the application of privacy by design and privacy by default techniques. And also joining us from Iron Mountain is Dave White. And Dave is the Director of Software Engineering and Technical Product Management for Iron Mountain Policy Center. David has been focused on advancing information governance through technology and automation since he joined Iron Mountain in 2014. So now I'm going to turn things over to Peggy Winton to begin today. Hey, Peggy.
Hi, thanks so much, Teresa, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm not surprised that we have such a robust crowd with us today. This is such an important topic, and it's an interesting one in that we're taking a little bit of a twist. We've certainly seen over the last few years a disconnect between information management and overall business strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about those points that were brought out in recent research conducted by AIIM and co-written and subsidized by Iron Mountain. We thank them for that. But we find that we also don't see a lot of discussion about information governance or records management disciplines or applications and data privacy. And today we're going to talk about a way to manage both of those at the same time through new automation techniques. So super excited to be presenting with Greg and Dave. And we know that it's a timely topic, particularly after what we've seen last year. So if you've been with us, you for a while and years, you know that the AIIM community has long made the connection between the excessive amount of information that flows into and swirls around our organizations and the compliance and the legal risk that this carries. But I don't think organizations can continue down the path of viewing information management decisions merely in a tactical, cost or compliance minimization filter. I think if they do, they will never change the status of information management, which, according to that research that we just conducted, really is viewed as an afterthought in many organizations versus completely and tightly aligned with their business strategy. So a shift in mindset is definitely needed now. And I think that this year is really going to be the year of reckoning. And why is that? I think this shift in perception is particularly critical now because of three important factors. They're really almost a trifecta as they collide with each other, but together support this need. And the first is simply that the long-term trends that create information chaos, we talk about that at AIIM a lot. That's the increasing volumes and the varieties of information. They're only accelerating. They are not going to be minimized. You know that when we asked the AIIM community to look ahead just 2 years from now, and we asked, by what percentage do you think that information volume is going to grow in your organization? And they say that it's almost 5 times in just the next 2 years. I don't know about you, but I have long since lost the opportunity and the ability to control or keep pace with the big data that's surrounding me and even in my everyday work. And the second is that the pendulum that swung so widely in the direction of remote working last year as a result of the pandemic forced so many organizations into a mad dash or a mad scramble to deploy collaborative tools. And those tools provided everybody with access, and some for the first time, regardless of where it was they had their desk. But it certainly opened up not only risk and exposure, but sprawl when it comes to content. And thirdly, nothing screams pandemic like our customer demands for speed and availability. So those demands are going to outlast the pandemic-induced demand that our products and services that we're delivering be delivered in the way that they want and at the pace that they come to expect. Those are pretty profound factors. When we asked our community to grade themselves when it comes to meeting these three challenges, they gave themselves a C minus. A C minus. That's from what we would consider information management gurus or pros. Interestingly, their executives tended to grade themselves a little bit higher than that. But the community took an honest look and made a self-assessment in a C minus. That's pretty sobering. And in a digital age, the everyday decisions that organizations make about how they deal with information chaos, and I'd like to say with the enablement of information for innovation's sake, they've really got to become strategic business decisions. And that's a record that you'll hear me play over and over again. So as such, it's really more critical than ever before that organizations make a commitment to move away from manual governance. Manual governance. So Dave, what's wrong with manual governance? How come manual won't cut it when we talk about chaos and customer demand?
Sure. Thanks, Peggy. So let me start off by just covering a few critical governance areas and what we mean by doing them manually in the first place. Just provide a basic level set of a few different areas. And I think what you're going to hear is a pretty consistent theme because it all boils down, in my own words, to skills and scale combined together. The two combined will equal good compliance. So it really all starts off with, I'll go inside out. From the back office, everything to me really begins with legal research and the maintenance of it, right? So this is a bit of a do-it-yourself versus outsourcing type of a discussion. In the process of capturing and curating relevant laws, even in a single industry, in a single jurisdiction, can very quickly yield a large volume of legal data that needs to be interpreted and organized in such a way that it can be used for the next step, which is deriving rules and organizing into the record class taxonomy. When we think about adding even more countries globally, this problem starts to grow very quickly. And before you know it, you've got such a large volume of data, you really can't keep track of it. Not to mention, in some cases, physical access to the law is difficult. Nowadays, most things are online and most things are written in our native languages, but that is definitely not always the case. So challenges are aplenty when it comes to doing legal research. And we see that when organizations try a take it on themselves approach, they quickly find it to be incredibly time consuming and not very cost effective. So that's one of the first challenges everyone comes up against. Next up, we see spreadsheets being used for global retention schedules and regional exceptions. In the absence of a purpose-built information governance system, spreadsheets really are the most popular tool of choice. We often see customers with not just one, but rather a collection of interrelated spreadsheets that contain record classification scheme, links to extracted legal data, retention rules often broken out according to a global common rule or a regional exception. And when these rules change, this creates a ripple effect through these spreadsheets that sometimes can take weeks. I've had literal examples of customers taking weeks to go through them all. And you can imagine that's error prone and time consuming and just really not what anyone wants to spend their time doing. Going a little further down in manual classification. So once the legal research is done, all the rules have been defined, and we have a record retention schedule rather ready to use, how do we actually put it into use? Well, a common approach for doing this is to publish the retention schedule into a content management system, or in some cases, much worse, a static document on the internet, and then expect the data custodians to determine where the record belongs in this retention schedule, manually placing it into a folder or assigning a tag or something along these lines. And the sheer volume of data and the mixed skill set across these different custodians can lead to inconsistencies. So everyone has a varied level of familiarity with the schedule, and let's not forget, they have additional job responsibilities. This is not their core skill set. So even the most well-intentioned custodian that studies hard has a partial time allocation to this job, basically leading to inconsistencies, which can yield to the wrong classification. And furthermore, if the classification step itself is too far removed from the time the original business record was created, there could be important loss of information, causing the classification again to be wrong, even in the most well-intentioned situation. And lastly, the sheer volume of data makes this job harder every day. My final item on this one is really about triggers, retention triggers, and the final destruction processing itself. Now, while some retention periods are very straightforward, they begin the moment the business record is created, that's the majority of cases, and it might give people a false sense of security. There are hundreds of other business events that can range from HR events of hiring new employees or corporate actions surrounding board meetings, etc. This can be further exacerbated by the fact that there are likely numerous repositories across the enterprise with different capabilities. You used the word sprawl earlier. I really think that's a perfect word. I might steal that if you don't mind. So capturing all of these different business events manually, knowing where these different records are, going to these different systems with varied capabilities and entering this data can be very, very difficult or impossible. And what we often find is it leads to records being kept longer than they need to be, in many cases, indefinitely. So I'm sure that's an incomplete list, but hopefully it sets a stage for the rest of this conversation and some of the problems we face.
I'm curious, Dave, do you and Greg find that it's a function of size of organization related to how many people are kind of just these activities are just thrust upon them? instead of having fully trained and committed IG or RM people. I mean, we find in AIM research that more and more people are doing those functions, and that wasn't their the reason they were hired. But is it a function of just size, or is it how regulated their industry is?
I would say, in my experience, it's a pretty mixed bag. The larger companies tend to know about this problem naturally, and therefore have dedicated staff. But even then, even the largest companies have a fairly small staff that's dedicated to this problem. So there may be a team of records managers where some of the custodians don't even know who they are until they get a knock on the door.
Yeah.
Right. So I think even in the largest companies that have very robust management programs, not all employees are exposed to them. And of course, on the lower end of the spectrum, nobody really understands the problem they're trying to solve. They just realize they saw in Information Governance magazine that day that someone else got fined, and they don't want to be fined.
Yeah, and you said it. I mean, we see cross-departmental boundaries is where a lot of this happens, just because there are fiefdoms, and as you say, there's so many different touch points. Not everybody that's responsible has been trained or is even part of the information governance team. So, time for a little honesty here. We're going to launch a poll. I'll let Teresa set it up now, and we're going to ask you. All right, so we talked about challenges of that. Dave did a great job talking about how much we're exposed when we do that. But let's be honest. To what extent is your company automating data governance and compliance processes? Is it 0 to 20%, 21 to 40%, 41 to 60%, 61 to 80%, or even more, up to 100%? Give you a second. Be honest now. What's it like at your organization? All right, let's see how we did here. Wow. Okay, what do you make of that, Dave and Greg? Looks like we've got our work cut out for us today.
I'd say there's room for improvement.
That's right.
Kind of across the board. Obviously, those that are very low, there's ripe areas there for automation that can help. And even those that are in the higher end, the 81 to 100, there's probably some areas of optimization where automation can help with the overall process. So, not overly surprised by this kind of slanted bell curve, but very interesting to see these results.
I'm a bit surprised. The AIM community, and certainly information governance experts among them, a little bit surprised, but we appreciate your candor and your honesty. So this is going to be good. We'll have a lot of fun and a lot to talk about as we go on. So there's another reason to ensure that governance and compliance tasks are automated to the maximum extent possible. And that's to eliminate or minimize worker intervention. I will never forget one of our members at Raytheon saying, "I know I'm doing my job when my business users don't know I'm doing my job." And I really, really like that, because as much as we want to talk about the wonderful world of governance, a lot of our users just glaze over and they don't really care. So, Dave, why do we want to eliminate worker intervention? We talked about the mistakes that can happen, but talk about the other users within the organization. Why do we want to do that, and why is that so important to do it now?
Sure. I'll get to the why, but I'd say in many ways the reasons for automation are to avoid all of the problems that we were just talking about just a moment ago. So of course that's intentional, right? These two things play off each other. But if I go through each of those areas again and talk about what automation is going to bring to the table, I think we'll get an answer to that question as to why do this, right? So in the back office, so if I start again with the inside out approach to this one, the legal research itself, let's be honest with each other. At some point, I think we probably all were told that artificial intelligence and machine learning would replace all the lawyers, and this would just happen automatically and be completely free. Well, that hasn't quite happened. So the research itself at this point is really more of an economy of scale topic than it is about pure automation. But I hammer this one consistently because it really truly is the heart of the defensible disposition approach. And I want to be absolutely straight as to where we are. We look for automation opportunities in research constantly, but that one really is, I think, primarily a quality and an economy of scale point. So next up, by replacing spreadsheets with data automation systems, it really hits on this first point here. Employees can focus on value-added activities by organizing the data in a more straightforward way with a relational system that can be avoiding the redundancy of the spreadsheets, avoid that ripple effect, provide some consistency with the rules. We get much higher quality, right? Higher quality and less time. That equals business outcome, successful business outcomes in every scenario.
You know, Dave, we talked about the customer demands growing, but that's not just external customers, it's internal as well.
Right.
And when you ask the workers to do this, they look at it as just pure drudgery. Absolutely. You know, who loves to, classify and drag themselves? No one.
Right, absolutely the case, and there's a saying that we've thrown around this place for a long time, which is the governance really needs to be out of mind and be more like if I dare say it, more like spell check, where it's just there. Once upon a time, spell check was not just there. Nobody would even consider it not being there now. I think ultimately governance has to have that same level of engagement with the end user community, ideally. And so if I were to keep going, triggers and destruction processing, this is another area of it's ripe for automation aimed at this time savings and improving quality, right? So most companies have the business records sprawled out across the enterprise. So just capturing all that data can be very difficult. So one bit of automation is sort of the centralized view, right? A centralized view of the data itself, which does a few things. One, it gives better visibility and access, but also can serve as a central point of integration. So for example, if we identified a certain business record as an applicant resume, it's just an easy example I like to talk about, everyone's familiar with them. We know that the retention period for an applicant resume is typically driven by their termination status or their employment status, right? So being able to integrate with an HR system, we can bring in data automatically about that employee, update their business records through this automated process, and begin the countdown automatically. Otherwise, somebody, a data custodian, is responsible for periodically essentially doing that, absolutely spending a lot of time and a very high error rate in the process. So this is one of the main areas on destruction that I think yields a lot of benefit. And then bringing us back to records classification. I'll touch on this one and then I'll hand it over to Greg to elaborate a bit more on it. But one of the problems I mentioned is this idea of a data custodian need to make an individual decision, record by record, on where it should belong in the record classification scheme. This to me right here is a great improvement opportunity where I promote the idea of really inverting that relationship entirely. I promote the idea of records managers getting a solid sense of their business processes and the documents or record types that are in those processes and pre-classifying them at the highest level into the taxonomy ahead of time. It's really the heart of an idea I call governance rules, which is about knowing what the document type is, knowing what business process defines it, and knowing where that belongs in the record class taxonomy, such that in the end user systems, automation can now step in. Greg will explain some more details how, but automation can step in and answer just a few questions about that business record that then can be very narrowly focused. What is it? What jurisdiction is it? And then we can use that earlier work to do classification automatically. So basically, by providing the answers to three key questions, what is it, what jurisdiction, and what's its process, we can then provide retention requirements in a seamless, straightforward way. Greg, let me hand this over to you now, and you can elaborate a little bit more about what you've been doing with metadata.
Sure. Thank you, Dave, and thank you to AIIM as well for hosting. Yeah, so as has been said multiple times already, there's many reasons why manual classification is suboptimal. especially when dealing with kind of the 3 V's of data. So velocity, variety, and volume. So how much, how frequent, and how varied is it across your business? When I look at this from as the AI guy, when I look at this from an AI or ML perspective, it's an area that's ripe for automation or using those particular tools or those particular offerings to enhance the overall user experience. When we think of content metadata, and when we think of classification, classification is metadata, right? So we have a file, we have a piece of content. We might have some physical metadata around it, such as file name, storage location, create date, who created, things of that nature. And that's often what we think about when we think about metadata, but there's a lot more from that. So there's also the content that's within the information, or the information within the content itself. So that can be oftentimes much more valuable than the actual physical metadata that's provided manually. So how do we get that out? What's the process that we actually go through to understand the content and add structure to that unstructured data? Well, there's many different ways that we can do that, whether it's through computer vision, OCR, natural language processing, whether we're using AutoML or transfer learning, whether we're using in-house developed models, or those created by a hyperscale cloud provider like Google, Amazon, or Microsoft, or any other approach, really. I think the key point is that the technology exists for what I like to call intelligent document processing. And what that is that's the process of taking a piece of information, that could be a document, an image, a video, an audio file, whatever, and running it through the process to understand what it is. And that could be, start with classification. So as it enters, Dave made the good point of doing this as early as possible. So as content is entering the enterprise, that's the ideal time to do this type of analysis. Early and often is how I like to say it. So, as it enters, we need to first determine what this particular piece of content is. Is it a contract? Is it an invoice? Is it an HR document? What's the overall classification that we want to put this under? Once we know what it is, we also know what's important about that piece of information as well, and what other information we might want to pull out from the actual content itself. As a quick example, for invoices, it could be company name, payment terms, and the individual line items or amounts. For contracts, it could be the effective date, the limited liability, and other contract terms might be important there. HR document, it could be employee name, social security number, or employee ID, hire date, or termination date. All of that information is contained within that unstructured content, but these tools allow us to run models and pipelines against it to bring that information out and surface it in such a way where it's now related to the individual piece of content itself. So once it's extracted and once it's related as metadata to the original content, we have this through intelligent document processing. We can then kick off the other downstream processes, whether it be governance, whether it be privacy or compliance efforts, or just making data available for search and retrieve operations throughout the enterprise. And we'll talk about some of those benefits here in a little bit as well. But just one other thing to kind of say is that AI and ML is not a replacement for resources. I like to view it as an enabler of resources. So basically freeing up the mundane work, taking care of the classification and the extraction of information for common things that are expected, and allowing the custodians to focus on the higher value add or the more complex scenarios that really need their expertise and attention. So really focusing their efforts on those types of scenarios, and automating the rest to kind of the more automated process. Now, that's not to say that if it's automated, no one needs to look at it. Obviously, there needs to be some human in the loop or exception processing that needs to happen as well to validate the record. So whether that's a certain percentage that gets kicked off to exception processing or a validation step, or based off a certain threshold of confidence coming from the ML side, there's different ways that can be configured. But the main objective there is to free up those resources, allow them to do those higher value add, more complex types of operations, free them up from handling the mundane, And the good news is that, using that human in the loop and exception processing, now we have an additional layer of training data that can be sent back through to the models for reinforcement learning to make them better. So, I look at, automation, AI, ML go hand in hand with extraction and classification, and really kind of, closing the loop and making sure that that we're constantly striving to be better and get better through the application of these technologies.
And I think in that you have established a way for information governance folks to have a seat at the business strategy table, because if much of this is automated, they can be thinking about the enablement of information, not just the locking down, where
Exactly
I think
right.
they've comfortably dwelt for a while. So I think, Dave and Greg, you've done a good job of taking this first part of our objective today, and that was to increase the odds of alignment between information governance or information management in general and business mission and business strategy. So this is a good time to talk about the data privacy piece of all this and its alignment, or I'd like to think lack thereof, with information governance. Often, we at AIIM find that the folks who are tasked with privacy and security tend to sit in IT. They also tend to be the beneficiaries of organizational funding. And, you don't have to go far before you're reading about or you're hearing about efforts to understand the letter of the law when it comes to privacy regulations. But taking steps ahead of time and involving information governance and records management folks in setting practical guidelines for the preparedness and prevention part of privacy doesn't always occur. So I think it's really important to create and fund a privacy program that directly aligns with existing organizational RIM and IG programs to protect personal data. And with modern and easy to use capabilities, much of what you two have just described, the automation of both retention and privacy policies is possible. So that's super exciting. That's a really neat concept. We certainly have found, with all of the customer demands increasing over this last year, so too has a customer realization and recognition of how important it is to protect their own data privacy and how much onus they're putting on the brands and the companies that they work with, and expecting them to do the same. So let me ask you both, you base the optimization of both retention and privacy automation on 3 factors. So why don't you tell us what are those factors when it comes to the capabilities?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one. So really, the 3 factors to get started with, I think it's a where do I start kind of a problem, right? And I think best practice is always going to be our driver, right? We've been in a world of retention for a long time now. We've been very focused on the legal requirements to keep things long enough, with always the other side of the coin being presented about disposing of information as soon as you can. But for all the reasons we've been discussing, many times that just isn't the case. So we've seen privacy influence here really as a very strong driver of retention. We see it push in the other direction and making this concept of maximum retention really come to the surface more and more each day. Each customer engagement that learns more about privacy regulations, it really, I couldn't agree more with what you were saying earlier, that retention and privacy really go hand in hand in so many places. Not exactly the same discipline, of course, but the overlap that is present and the skill set and the discipline needed to do it, we believe that the records management space is the right place for it all day long, and that these 2 programs should be managed together. So that's a first part of best practice, is to acknowledge the strong relationship with retention and the strong overlap in the skill set of records management. That I see exactly what you mentioned, that IT is often the the custodian of privacy. However, they really don't necessarily know what to do, and they need to be well informed through a strong governance program. Some examples that we see here on the screen: data subject access requests. This brings with it a whole new set of requirements that, in order to respond to something that sounds simple on the surface, what data are you tracking about me? Well, that requires a well-documented set of what the processes are, where that data could be, what geography it resides in, what system it resides in. We see an ever increasing need for cross-border data transfer requirements, whether that be for efficient processing of data from one region to the next, or it touches on this remote workforce aspect quite a bit as well. Who can access the data? Where is it flowing? Has it changed where it's flowing based on the reality of an increased remote workforce? So we really see that this optimization is based on some best practices surrounding retention and where in the organization the discipline should lie. Really a risk-based approach. Large companies often don't know where to start. They recognize they can't do it all at once. So it has to be this balanced, sort of a quadrant of high risk, lower effort is the right place to start. And of course, each company has to form their own opinion on where their risk appetite is. It might be cross-border data transfer. We definitely see that coming up quite a bit. Or it might be that they've got a large repository of credit cards that they haven't purged in a long time, or something like this, right? So that our historical best practices of you can't hack it if you don't have it still hold true, but privacy really has brought forward several new topics like this one. So that's really how I would approach prioritization and optimization in the space.
Dave, I have to jump in here and ask you, we for years saw so many organizations almost play the negative lottery when it comes to risk. And they're just, saying, oh, can never happen to me, or we're willing to almost fund that risk. Do you think that has changed because of customer awareness of the value of their data? Do you see a change there?
I do think
or do you
so.
think the fines are now meaningful?
I think all of the above, really. I think the news headlines talking about privacy and talking about data breaches. I mean, I have some older family members who refuse to use ATMs because they were afraid of information security. And now those people are reading headlines about data breaches and calling me and saying, "What does this mean? Has this happened?" So I absolutely think there's sort of a corporate consciousness that has increased based on just the reality and the laws and the sort of public awareness. Absolutely. And I also think that at the end of the day, the fines speak pretty loudly as well. We've been waiting, I feel we've been waiting for case law to really settle how many fines and how much. What did you call it? Negative lottery. I love that term as well. How many people will continue to play the negative lottery, even in a highly fined or high risk fine scenario? People may still choose to do that one. Obviously, it's not what we promote, but I think you're absolutely right that it's really a combination of these factors.
Yeah, and it's fascinating when you really dig into it because, sadly, the legislation is always lagging behind the technology, and we as consumers have kind of given up everything in favor of convenience. And is that going to change? Don't know. But one of the things you mentioned earlier is that it's pretty difficult for the average person tasked with this to keep current on all the updates to retention and privacy requirements. And that could be based just, in a single jurisdiction. But imagine if you operate across different borders, and keeping tabs on the types of law required to support retention and privacy policies. So my next question for you guys is, how can that be simplified for organizations, particularly those that may not have a huge, dedicated, and trained staff?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I don't think there's a very easy answer to it, but I would say at the foundation, it's about understanding the spirit of the law in the first place and making sure that your information governance program is really touching on the key aspects first. So meaning, what is the nature of a data access request and what kinds of processes do you need to support these? Because generally speaking, the law does not go from black to white or red to green, or there aren't major changes. So I think it's about establishing a solid foundation first, and it may be incomplete on the organization, but in certain areas at least, get a real understanding of how the baseline and the spirit of the law affects you. And from that point, you'll have a foundation that then, using either outside counsel or other research sources, or maybe there's news feeds or conferences or webinars you can go to. When you hear about small changes, you have a solid foundation to evaluate what that change means. It's much different than if you don't have a solid program and you hear about a new law. This is sort of a start over moment, unless there's a clear foundation. So really, my answer to keeping current is establish a solid foundation that you understand deeply, document these processes, and then keep current on the laws as they change, and participate in industry forums as much as possible so that you understand how to incorporate that change into your own environment. Of course, technology, as a technology person, I have to say it plays probably a huge role in this one, because the technology is how that program is going to be established in the first place, and how you can see quickly if this small piece changes, what does it mean to me? What records was it tied to? What data sources was it tied to? Where exactly does this change matter to me?
You know that business processes are a big source for personal data. So they're particularly vulnerable. Of course, they're also hugely valuable because that's the front lines with the customer typically. So here's my next question for you. How do you help organizations map their business processes? And as we said earlier, it's really, where content meets processes gives our organizations the biggest angst and presents the biggest challenges when it comes to governance.
Sure. So we have both throughout our professional services organization and through various software tools we have. If you could just jump to the next slide, please. So both through the professional services and through our software features, we really keep a solid line tying to, I should say not a solid line, a circle around retention and privacy, so that they are organized together. So once we have our record class taxonomy, we factor in privacy obligations directly to it that are very much unique to the customer, what industry they're in and what geographies they're in, again, based on this legal research, but we do organize them very much together. So that's the beginning piece, is to tie privacy and retention together. You see them both at a glance. We've added features for GDPR Article 30, which has a requirement for documenting such business processes. There's really several different ways we can do that, ranging anywhere from a tabular, very data-centric view of this process produces the following things, or a business process activity, which we'll see on the next slide in just a moment, is an example of one where it can be a very graphical representation. And it really depends on the user style and which one works best for them. But what we really do within the tools is make sure that no matter which view you're using, it's the same information. It's not just a picture. It's a picture that has objects in it that are tied back to the core systems that all really are mapped together. And I think that's probably one of the most critical pieces of this one. So between the process mapping, the data mapping, and making sure we can document where the privacy relevant pieces of information are. And there's a few different pieces of metadata we capture there, sensitivity levels, et cetera, that really are the heart of our privacy offering. So if we can jump over to the next one, we can see an example here where this is an example of a policy center processing activity diagram. It's written in a traditional notation, as business processing modeling notation. So this is not unique to our tool by any means, but this as a concept is really very important, because mapping the business process itself is really like half the battle, but the other half is the data lineage. Where did it come from? Where is it going? How is it going to be used? And our emphasis is really on keeping it simple, because if it's complex, nobody's going to do it. And even with this simple approach, we see sometimes it's more than companies expected when they first started. So it's about this, where is the source of the data Where is it stored and how is it used? And then flowing all the way to its end of its life and keeping track of these activities along the way. So we really have a great emphasis on the mapping and the documentation of these.
So we've identified 5 key benefits that we think can be derived from these tools. So let's walk through each of them now, and I'm going to ask Dave and Greg to give some examples or insight, maybe even metrics from their actual customers. The first is defensible disposition. We've talked about that. And complying with regulations like GDPR, CCPA, any number of them that are with us now or coming down the pike, organizations always express fear about restricting the personal information they collect and share. And today's solutions, I think, ought to be designed to manage data governance based on best practices, as Dave and Greg pointed out, as opposed to just specific regulatory directives. Because in order to be innovative, we actually want to be able to harness and leverage data about our customers as an asset versus restrict it out of fear of liability. So talk to me, Dave, about what you see and how you're advising your customers when it comes to knowing what to dispose of, which has become almost more important than knowing what to keep.
Sure. Yeah, I guess obviously our customers all have defensible disposition as a goal. It's a great place to start. And one of our most successful examples of it really is with a global insurer and reinsurer, one of the largest out there. Now they have a homegrown records management system that fully automates disposition for all unstructured content. So we help them achieve this one. The key to their program, however, is not technology, but rather a process-based metadata taxonomy. So documenting these processes was key, that all of their business processes throughout the organization must follow, not just records management. So the business process taxonomy has formed the basis for reporting and budgeting throughout the entire organization. Now that's a massive win that Policy Center was really at the heart of for that organization.
The second one I love talking about because it's demonstrating an accountability for private data in your custody. One of AIIM's certified information professionals said, "You can't control what you can't see." And I love that. I really do. And, there's so many intersect points and so many process owners. So how do you demonstrate accountability, particularly if we see that the tension and the angst is across departments, across functions?
Sure. Yeah. Similar to defensible disposition, most of our customers have followed a traditional attestation approach to demonstrating accountability. One example, European-based global bank that we work with has really stood out in terms of demonstrating accountability through automation. We worked with their wealth management division on a field-by-field inventory of all customer private information, which they then used to target anonymization and encryption technologies to secure the information at risk. So this is with a central repository where these are the rules of engagement to come in. So now that repository can be a source of attestation, and anyone who doesn't follow it correctly is responsible for their own. And what we've seen is that's a great motivator for the departmental units to really understand what this means and to follow the best practices and guidelines, really to form this attestation.
And obviously, organizations want to reduce the risk of fines. That's where it hurts in their pocketbooks. They also want to protect their IP, their intellectual property. They don't want their confidential information to be exposed. I'd actually add another one to this third third capability, and that is reputational risk. They want to reduce that, and that's become so important now. As somebody said, we've lost our trust in elected officials. We've lost our faith in religious leaders, but we look to brands as sort of our moral compass. So losing that trust and reputation really hits big brands and big organizations in a hard way.
Sure, and fortunately for us, we have not had any direct losses or fines within our customer base. I guess that means we must be doing something right. But unfortunately, we are often called upon to improve information governance practices after the fact. So some people find the need the hard way, if you can say it that way. In one of the largest data breaches in the US history, one of our partners determined that the ultimate cause of that breach was an unsecured spreadsheet full of administrative passwords. And so, that one was definitely one we've all heard of. It was in the news. It's a name we would easily recognize. And ultimately, it was all boiled down to unsecured access to a simple spreadsheet of administrative data. If that one had been properly governed, the whole thing would have been avoided.
Wow. And Greg, we've talked about our internal customers being as demanding as our external ones, and everyone wants access to the information they need in order to do their jobs. They want it when they need it, and they also want it in context. Mm-hmm. So talk about that in relation to conversations you're having with your customers.
Sure, and I liked your wording when we came to this slide when you asked us to provide insight on each one of these items, because the product that I work most closely with is Iron Mountain Insight. So thank you for the plug.
Okay.
But essentially, what we're doing is, with our platform is when we run content through our IDP layer, so our intelligent document processing layer, we're enabling the structure to that unstructured content. So we're enabling the use of metadata. So we're pulling it out of the content and making it usable. And that's really, across the board for granting or restricting access. So you mentioned remote workforces as well. Through COVID, everybody being remote, you don't have the access to control file cabinets anymore. So you have to do it virtually. And now a lot of those rules or business processes can be done through the metadata layer. Greg has access to all of the HR files except for where, employee level equals executive, because that's a very closely held secret. Similarly, being in the contracts use case, being able to say, what's my latest contract with company XYZ, or how many contracts do I have with limited liability over $10 million? Whatever that threshold would be. Once that metadata is enabled, the ability for it to be used in simple search and retrieve operations is really tremendous.
And, it is all about getting insights so that decisions can be made and information can be operationalized. So how does the solution provide that?
Yeah, so it comes down to what's the question that you're trying to answer, and that's going to be very unique for every company and every individual, and that's going to also dictate the data and the data that we're feeding in and the analysis that we're going to be doing on it. So when we're talking about mapping business processes, that's really key in understanding what's the desired objective or the desired outcome that you want to have. A quick example for that: we work with a loan servicing company that was in the process of reviewing a rather large portfolio of loans that they were considering buying. So they wanted to go through the process of doing more complex QA checks, quality assurance checks, things like, are these loans complete? Are all of the documents that I need for a complete loan there? Are they signed in the right places? Are we missing signatures? Does the APR on the document match the APR in the loan origination system? So all of those types of QA activities really, are directly related to whether or not they were going to purchase this portfolio. So having that metadata available to them, having it early in the process, enables them to make those business decisions in a more effective manner based off of that metadata that's extracted from the content itself.
all good aspirations here. So how do organizations get started? You both have mentioned Policy Center, which I understand is a new offering from Iron Mountain. It's okay. We can talk about that and then talk about recommendations in a best practices way. How do you advise your organizations to get started?
Sure, it often begins with an assessment and consultation about the health of the program to begin with. And really almost every engagement starts with that. But then as far as, storing the answers to that data and getting started on the definition of the program, obviously I'm here to recommend Policy Center as the best tool to store all of your various pieces, your record classes. We provide the legal citations and keep them up to date on your behalf. They're fed directly into your entire ecosystem of data, organized with the record classes, and you can really choose to go small or big. There's a lot of features set to map out the rest of the organization with the different data sources and custodians, but it's not entirely necessary. So this can be a crawl, walk, run type of a situation where we can start off with just retention, grow into privacy, or grow even more around retention to even all the way up to what I was talking about earlier with this governance rule concept, where the document and record types themselves can be pre-classified in Policy Center, allowing it to be the home of records management. And then if you build the next piece of the slide, please, the privacy feature set includes this it includes this idea of visualization of the data. So the process maps, data flow maps, and processing activities. These are all seamlessly tied together inside Policy Center, and we provide API-based integration to other systems as well. Of course, we're part of the Iron Mountain ecosystem, so we're going to be completely seamlessly integrated with Iron Mountain Insight. So any data being processed over there or all the metadata coming through will flow seamlessly through Policy Center. It is also an open API that can be integrated with other systems. So it's meant to be what serves the customers best. Of course, we promote Iron Mountain Insight as the best tool to manage most of that content, but if you are already a customer of other systems, we can integrate with them as well through an open API, and we have some pre-built connectors over to workflow automation powered by Highland, as well as the Micro Focus content manager systems. So we really are always looking around for what the customers need best as a means of prioritization.
We've got just a few minutes left, and I know we got some questions. We'll try to quickly get to those, and if not, we will answer them after the time with a direct outreach. So what are some best practice recommendations when we talk about getting started for organizations that go beyond even Policy Center?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if I were to summarize the whole speech, it really is automate to maximum extent possible. Through all the various layers, through generation of the data, beginning with collecting, introducing records management as soon as possible into the life cycle. It just, we see the sooner the better, really, and make a prioritized approach. Tackle your high risk items first.
Great piece of advice. Let's answer one question that I think is particularly interesting and poignant here before we say goodbye. And that is, what do you do about business intelligence demands, maybe by business or analytics folks in the organization, to keep information that they say they want to keep for longer periods of time, and they struggle around retention and privacy because it's like the more we've got, the more decisions we might be able to make, or intelligence might be gleaned. How do you balance those two needs?
Yeah, I'll start that one just real quick here as well. I know we only have a minute or two left. Yeah, there's definitely I know many ML engineers that want all of the data all of the time, and they'll take whatever data is available to them. But the days of having that available to them is no longer there, and that started well before GDPR. But GDPR kind of put the nail in the coffin, where for customer data you have to explicitly tell people what your intended use of the data is for. So you can't keep things just to find a reason for using it in the future. You have to be very explicit with, what what the operations are that you're going to do with that data, along with what data you're collecting on them. So I think that through regulation, that's already starting to be addressed in being able to actually maintain data and limit the overall usage. And I would also say that there's redaction tools, and there's also kind of depersonalization tools that are out there that can abstract the data, so they're almost just as good for business intelligence purposes as the original data, but they're not identifiable to an individual. So whether that be through aggregation, whether that be through other tools or things like that, there's other approaches that we can take. But happy to follow up offline. I think that we're at the end of time.
Yeah, that's great. I really want to thank both Dave White and Greg Mura. We have some great questions, and we will follow up directly for you. You know that AIM has all sorts of resources. We hope you'll avail yourselves of those training, whether you want to take it one step further and pursue the Certified Information Professional designation. So thanks so much. I really, really enjoyed the time. Hope you all did too. And hope we taught you a few new things. So for Peggy Winton, for AIM, this is Peggy Winton, and thanks again to Dave and to Greg, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peggy.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.